This particular week, we're going to focus on boundaries and barriers and issues around parents and children. So, not everyone here has biological or other children, but we're all in a situation where we've had parents of some kind or caretakers, caregivers. And so, we're going to look at the relationships that we formed and some of the things that happen with that process. So, one thing I would say about all of the work that we do together, and certainly with this kind of work around boundaries, is that it's delicate work, that it's complex because our relationships are complex. And a lot of our experience with this happened when we were children, and we didn't really have any power to change our circumstances. So we're very vulnerable. So I wanted to start with some thoughts about this from Pema Chodron. Many of you are aware of Pema. She's a wonderful human being, a Buddhist nun, lots of humor and really practical, down to earth insights into how life works. One of the things she talks about with boundaries is that there's a reason why we set a boundary, and it's to let us communicate more, and that barriers shut down communication. And so sometimes we have a barrier because we can't afford to not. And sometimes we want to open up our barriers more into boundaries. And if we can really have a good look at what's going on, why is there a barrier? Sometimes it's needed. Then we can be as open as possible without hurting ourselves or other people. So when we turn away, and she talks about this willful turning away and shutting down that causes confusion and suffering. But why are we doing that? We're doing that because there's something that's traumatic or unhealed. We need to kind of figure that out so that we can have more freedom from our childhood experiences that were less than ideal, so to speak. So it takes courage to set a boundary, which makes sense. Not everybody who we set boundaries with is happy with that. Sometimes they will go after us and try and make it hard for us, especially if we're talking family. But it increases clarity. We can make a decision then. And so she talks about boundaries as being the most compassionate thing that you can do for yourself and others. And I would also add that if we can have boundaries, then we're less likely to need a barrier. And not to be foolish about this either. Sometimes we need a barrier. Sometimes we need no contact. And that's always difficult when we're in that situation. As I was preparing for this, one of the things that I so often hear and think too sometimes is, well, my parents did the best they could. And it's true. I do believe that's true. And when we look at intergenerational or historical trauma, in terms of the pictures that are on here, there's a lot of attention paid to military who go to war and end up with PTSD, mostly men. The picture right below that is kind of a Rosie the Riveter picture of how when women were needed in the factories during World War II, they were recruited. All of a sudden, it became patriotic duty to do your part for the war effort. But then what happened after the war was over, when all of those women were pushed out of those jobs, the jobs were given to the men who were returning from the war. And my mom was one of those. She wasn't in the war. She wasn't working during the war. She was just finishing high school and was accepted into engineering college, university. And she was flunked out of her math, which was ridiculous. She was really brilliant in math. And she didn't fight back. She went to secretarial school again. And when I asked her about it, she said, well, they didn't want me there. And the fact that the professor would mark my paper wrong, and she said, I compared it with the smartest guy in the class, and he said, you had a perfect score on that. It was 100%. But she said the fact that the professor would do that just meant that I was going to have to fight for every step of the way in engineering. And that was, 1945, 46. And she said, I couldn't do it. And so she ended up being quite resentful about that. And I'm very sure she's not the only woman. That was a really hard experience for women who had that freedom and their own money and had jobs and were able to really contribute, and then were pushed out of that. So there's a lot of things that we don't necessarily think about, although it might be something that had a really huge impact in our own life. And then when people are struggling like that, we always try to mitigate that somehow. We always try to feel better somehow. And alcohol and drugs are a way that many, many people manage that. And people come home from war. There's that kind of stereotype of a man coming home from war and drinking, which is not universally true for sure. And it was very common as well. And that created so much suffering. So just to know that our parents were human beings who lived in a certain cultural time, historical time. There's so many things that impact us. And how can we just kind of hold that in our hearts as we're not being stupid about it? We're not kind of using it as an excuse, but we're acknowledging that things are hard for many people. So the fact that they did their best and that they struggled doesn't change the fact that they were abusive or neglectful, that there was something about their own unhealed trauma that they weren't able to really parent us well. And for me, I grew up in a family where we were well taken care of physically. We had the music lessons and dance lessons and good food, and there was no alcohol or violence in the home. But there was an emotional disappearance, there was an emotional abandonment. And so this takes many, many flavors. And oftentimes when we don't have the stereotypical, I was terrified at home, we think that, well, I don't have the right to even feel that I had something kind of neglect, or that we think there's something wrong with us. And so people who had that experience in their home of being scared for their body have a different kind of an impact on the nervous system than I did. And it's really important that we don't minimize our traumatic experiences because somebody else had it harder. And it could be also that we make an excuse, well, my parents had it harder. Or they might say, well, I had it so much harder than you. What are you complaining about? So to let ourselves have the experiences that we have. And we have the right to set boundaries and to take time to heal our childhood trauma. There's so many dysfunctional patterns in families. And at some point, we need to really have a look and see not only what is my willingness and capacity to change, but what is theirs. And so often parents are still kind of feeling like they're entitled to make the rules, that they have a hard time giving over and being respectful of an adult child's adult life. And so if they're not willing to do their own trauma healing, or if they're not willing to have an adult relationship, then that really affects what we do. And I originally put cultivate compassion, but I also wanted to include neutrality here. So when we hate somebody, we're really stuck. So cultivating some kind of a neutrality, even towards somebody who harmed us, can be very helpful in freeing ourselves. And it also can take some of the drama and the intensity out of it and allow our conscious level mind and brain to understand things and to see things. So even as we set up a boundary or maybe a permanent barrier, might be temporary, just I need some time away. I need some time to process this without having your guilt trip all over me. Then we could still try to not get caught up in hatred, just to acknowledge that those feelings are natural and they're actually not very helpful to us or anybody else. So to try and cultivate some kind of neutrality around them. So children often get the message that their boundaries are less important than their parents' needs. So that could play out so many different ways. On the surface, we're a good family. Don't shame me in the eyes of the community can be very much more important than finding out what's troubling a child that will cause them to act out. And oftentimes, parents don't have really the capacity. And also, we're kind of going back generations, at one or two generations for sure, and looking at the culture at the time where there was no such thing as self help books. There was not really any understanding of trauma and interpersonal relationships and parenting and blended families and all of that. So we don't want to go back and retroactively judge kind of all parents of a few generations ago, but also we don't want to do that to our own parents either. So there's a lot of dysfunctional emotional patterns, and we don't want to have conflict. We want to have love and approval and inclusion, and oftentimes we kind of sweep things under the rug in order to not create some kind of disharmony. This is from Dr. Kay Vought. She's a psychologist that I worked with quite a few years ago now in the Kilby Center for the Family Program. And she has so much clarity around how these patterns work, and that we need to be able to manage our own anxiety in order to be part of this as an adult. And so if we're coming at it from with a very narrow window of tolerance, we're not likely to be able to really tolerate saying what we need to say or hearing what we need to hear, and to look at how we kind of go along with things because that's how we're getting our needs met. So, in an equal, healthy relationship, both people act like adults. They take equal responsibility for their emotional reactions and they talk things out rather than acting things out. I think that's such an important statement. They talk things out rather than acting things out. And that requires a lot of courage. So, the reality of both is equally honored. And she talks about this as a form of emotional abuse to not validate another person's perception. On the extreme case, that's gaslighting, where somebody is trying to make you believe that you feel something that you different from what you actually feel. But the more common with parents and childs, especially, is I'm right and you're wrong. And as a child, it's true that our parents know more, they've had more experience, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're right in terms, certainly not in terms of our own feelings, our own experience. And oftentimes we live in kind of that autocratic environment where there's a hierarchy there and the parents get to decide. And in our culture, often it's the man decides, and then the women and children have to kind of go along. So, in order to have an equal relationship, that has to shift. And that can be a process as adult children and their parents are having an adult relationship. So, I wanted to take a moment just now to sink into this last sentence here and see what comes up. So, notice your body, your breath, tune into your breath for a moment. And I, either coming from the perspective of a parent or from a child with parents, I honor your right to your own life and independence, to set your own course, and to have privacy and respect. And notice what response you might have in your mind, in your body. And notice as well that there can be a perfection kind of an impulse here or a drive. So we're not talking about, I need to go back and find all the times when I didn't do that. None of us are perfect in this, that's for sure. Just to sit with that. I honor your right to your own life and independence, to set your own course, and to have privacy and respect, to be your own person. You might be thinking of ways that you fell short. You might be thinking of ways your parents coerced you and didn't allow you that freedom. Maybe something that is related to a child that you have. Just let it kind of be there for a moment. See what's here. So I wanted to cover this directly. Sometimes people are estranged from their families, their parents, their siblings. It's quite common that there's some level of estrangement when there's been trauma, abuse, and neglect in the family. It's very seldom that siblings, for instance, will bond together and kind of try to protect each other against abusive parents. Sometimes it happens. Usually it's an older sibling trying to protect a younger one. But these kinds of environments and this kind of trauma that we have leave a mark on us. And the truth of it too is that even as we're doing this trauma healing work and we're really, in therapy, or we're doing this somatic inquiry, or we're really looking into and educating ourselves about family dynamics and all of these things, it doesn't mean that the other person or people that are involved will be doing the same thing. And sometimes we talk here about it's fairly rare, actually, that people have the capacity to do this work. So sometimes when we start working with our side of the fence, when we start working with our own, things will shift and maybe we'll have a conversation that opens something up. Maybe we can stay engaged in a different way than what we had before. And sometimes that doesn't happen. And so we don't want to take on responsibility and take on the blame for it not working, because it could just be that the other person doesn't have the interest or the capacity, and that's quite often the case. So having an estrangement in the family, whether it's a dramatic, it's on the table, everybody knows kind of estrangement, or whether it's more of a pulling away where I don't really trust my parents, I don't stay very connected with them, but I go for Thanksgiving and we all pretend everything's fine. There's such a range of different experiences that we have, but our family of origin is important. And sometimes we might have a lot of understanding of the complexity of our interactions as well as the other people. And also children, and I've noticed this myself when I'm talking in, an inquiry about things that happened when I was a child, and I'm like, well, they weren't that bad. And so oftentimes children will also want to have a more balanced view, will want to remember the good things. So it's that kind of goes along with that survival level imperative that children have to be connected in order to be safe and in order to live through to adulthood. And so sometimes we turn against ourselves. That's very common. And as an adult, we can really afford to look into that and see that. So let's pause here again. And depending on what's going on in your family, where you are on that continuum with your parents and other people, whether it's your children, your parents, your siblings, just to kind of take a moment, breathe again, get yourself back in your body if you've gone into a thinking stream. And to sit with these words: I honor my right to my own life and independence, to set my own course, and to have privacy and respect for my choices. And this is something we can do no matter what the other people involved are doing. I honor my own right to my life, my independence, respect, privacy. I need to be able to create the adult life that I feel is the right one for me. Notice your feet, your seat. Notice what's in your heart. What are the thoughts coming up as well? And that can feel very uncomfortable, especially when we've been raised and conditioned to believe that we don't actually have that right, that our job is to keep everyone else in the family happy or to try to fix things. That can feel like quite an intense statement. Just notice your response. Or maybe it's that you're more focused on that first sentence. Not every person is capable of a healthy, equal relationship. And if that's true of someone who's really important to you, then there's a lot of feeling around that. Notice your body, your breath. So let's take our time here as well. Kindness, respect, empathy, duty, love. There's probably other words that relate here as well. Connection, compassion. So the question, and this is something that came up in a workshop I was in with Gabor Mate several years ago. It says, what do we owe someone who is not our dependent child? And it was in the context of a friend being devastated because another friend had forgotten or wanted to do something else on a Friday night. And he said, it's not up to us to, like, that's not right that people would be devastated. They could be disappointed. They could decide maybe that they don't trust us enough to hang out with us or something, but we need to be responsible for our own lives and emotions and stability and resilience and all of that as an adult. The reason that I put this in here is because I think it's helpful to look at the dynamics of when we feel pressured. And sometimes when we're acting in an over functioning kind of a capacity, when we're taking care of things that the other person really could be doing on their own, that we're the ones who has to change that relationship dynamic. And one of the questions we can look at is, so I've got my side straightened out. I'm acting respectfully. I'm kind. I'm generous. I'm trying to do the right thing. And is that mutual? Are they also trying to do that? Or are they kind of taking advantage of our good heartedness? So if everybody's trying, then we have a lot more room. If we're the only ones that are trying, then we're probably going to need to set some pretty firm boundaries. And can we afford the price? So sometimes we just get into these habits of helping or of, we have a rule that we don't talk to the alcoholic parent after 5 o'clock because we know that doesn't go well. But we still have a lot of other kinds of things that are going on that are hard for us. What is the price we pay? And the basic foundation here is that we don't owe somebody else our life. We don't owe someone else our own happiness in order to keep them happy. We don't owe them our time. We don't owe them our money. We don't owe them anything really, unless it's a dependent child who we're parenting. So it's not that we don't want to give those things to people, it's that we don't owe it to them. And so when we're being a person who's kind and generous and we're trying to have an open heart and really work on the relationship so that it works out better for us, and they're not, and then we have the stress of that, at some point we could have a really clear-eyed look at that. Can I afford the price? And notice there might be a lot of thoughts in your mind. You could always do some tapping or open your eyes, put the images or words in a frame if things are getting kind of intense. Just stay with it. Stay with your body, with your breath. It's not my job to fix their life. What's your response to that? So let's go into some inquiry. Bring up an image of someone. So there might be somebody that's come to mind as we've been working through the slides. And you might be thinking, well, I really know that I should set this boundary with the person. So see if you can think of something really specific, a specific person or people, if maybe it's both parents or something like that. or maybe it's a child, and bring up an image of their face and notice how you feel when you look at their face in your mind's eye. Does it make you uncomfortable? And here we're bringing in our nervous system and our primitive brain are bringing in our past experiences. So if every time we've said, you know, it doesn't work for us for you to come here drunk. We're going to have a lunch at Thanksgiving this time because we want you to not be drinking. And every time that happens, something bad happens. They start yelling at you or screaming, or they flounce out and then they don't come back. Or maybe if it's a child, they take your grandchildren away. So there could be a lot of history with this. So we're not talking about this is reasonable or not reasonable. But just as you can, stay really connected in your body, stay connected in your breath. The real crucial part of these somatic inquiries in our body is to stay connected in our body. And then imagine, and you could take a few minutes, we're going to take several minutes for this so you have time. If you were to state that boundary with them, imagine yourself seeing it, saying it, hearing the words. I want you to call before you come over. When you start yelling at me, I want you to notice that, and I'm going to notice too. And you need to back away from that and calm down first. Whatever it is that you might be wanting to say to them. And see yourself saying it. Notice what's happening in your body. There is going to be some kind of a response. And see what your response is to these. I can handle their hurt feelings. I can steady myself. I can handle their anger, their manipulation, their accusations. I can state my boundary. I can stay present to myself. Notice your breath. Relax your shoulders, your jaw. And if you're going in the direction of it's not going to go well, maybe they're going to yell at you or something like that, take a step back, deep breath, do some tapping on your forehead, put your hand on your heart. Remind yourself that this is an inquiry that's not actually happening, that you're not a child. A lot of these reactions are based on evidence from when we were a child. That if you're on the phone or on Zoom, you could hang up. If you're in person, you could walk out. You could also be doing this from the past. You could be imagining what it would have been like to have set a boundary like this with a parent. Maybe the parents are both gone by now. Or with a child if you have children or a child. It doesn't have to be something that you're planning to do this week. It could be something from the past. Just to bring it up, notice your response to the look on their face, to the possible words, things that they might do. Maybe you have someone who just bursts into tears and I'm such a horrible person and I didn't mean to hurt you. And then you end up kind of focusing on their hurt feelings and not on your boundary. So keep coming back, feet on the floor, seat in the chair. Notice your breath. And you could practice or come up with some phrases that would help. Like, I understand that you don't like my boundary. Setting this boundary helps me feel safer in our relationship. There's many other things that you could say too. I'm bringing this up because I want to connect with you. And this is one way that I'll feel more comfortable connecting, whatever it might be. And if the best thing to do in your mind is to walk out or hang up, then just do that. No guilt, no shame. It's not the right time. Right. Now let's let that go. Come back to regulation. Notice your breath. If you wanted to shake it out a little bit, you could stand or you could just move around in your chair. Shake it off the ends of your fingers. Take a few deep breaths. And then let's take a minute just to open up the heart. You can have your hands on your heart if you want. I cultivate compassion for myself. And you might bring in yourself as a child or now as an adult. And this is hard to do. It's hard to be honest. Becoming emotionally mature and responsible is a hard journey. And many of us never had any real good role models. So we're just doing our best. So see if you could feel a warmth in your heart for yourself as a child or as an adult or both. And then only if you want to, you could go to the second statement. I cultivate either neutrality or compassion for my parents as children and now as an adult. And if you don't want to go there, completely ignore it. Stay with compassion for yourself. Feel that in your body. If you tensed up during the inquiry, see if you could let those muscles soften. Take some deeper breaths. So when you're ready, you could open your eyes.